Manhattan, Tuesday morning. The day Ethan Caldwell found two sentences that destroyed everything he had. He stood frozen at the kitchen counter, staring at the notepad written in his wife's handwriting. Calm. Unbearably calm. I'm gone. Please don't look for me. Hands trembling. He called her sister. Where is she? She's 7 months pregnant. Ethan Dana's voice was quiet but cut like a blade. If she wanted to be found, she wouldn't have left. The line went dead. He stood alone in the middle of a 42-floor penthouse, vast, silent, and suddenly unbearable, not knowing that the wife he had just lost had been planning this disappearance for 14 months. Right beside him, while he never once looked up. This is the story of what she found out and everything he lost the moment she decided to leave. Stay with me all the way to the end, because nothing about this story goes the way you expect. I need you to picture something. A penthouse apartment, 42 floors above Manhattan. 5 in the morning. The city still half dark below. All glass and steel and lights that never fully go out. And a woman standing at the window. 7 months pregnant. One hand pressed flat against the cold glass. The other wrapped around a single leather bag. Everything she is taking with her. Everything she has decided is worth saving. It fits in one bag. She has been planning this moment for 14 months. Her husband does not know she is leaving. Her husband does not know a lot of things. And what he does not know is going to cost him everything. Every single thing. But before we get to what he lost, we need to talk about what she found out, because that is where this story actually begins. And I promise you, you are not going to see it coming. Her name was Claire Harper, and 3 years before that morning at the window, she was exactly the kind of woman who made other women feel like maybe the world was fair after all. She was 28 years old. She had just passed the bar exam on her first attempt. She was the first person in her family to finish law school. And she had done it on scholarships and double shifts and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. Her father was a mechanic in Columbus, Ohio. Her mother taught third grade for 31 years at the same elementary school where she herself had once been a student. They had a front porch. They knew their neighbors by name. When someone on the street was sick, people brought casseroles. When someone lost a job, people showed up with groceries and did not make a production of it. Claire had grown up understanding that the most important things in life were not the things you could put in a glass case. They were the things you did when nobody was watching. The things you were when nobody was testing you. She had plans, real plans. Public interest law, housing rights cases, work that meant something to people who needed someone in their corner. She had turned down 3 corporate firms to pursue it. 3 firms with salaries that would have paid off her student loans in 2 years. She turned them down without hesitation because she had not spent 6 years in school to spend her career making the powerful more powerful. The night she met Ethan Caldwell, she was not attending the charity fundraiser. She was working it. She was wearing a lanyard that said staff and carrying a clipboard and checking names off a list with the focused efficiency of someone who had somewhere else to be afterward. She was not performing anything for anyone in that room full of Manhattan's most connected people. She was just doing her job. Ethan noticed her before he had been in the room for 5 minutes. Not because she was the most beautiful woman there, though she was striking. Because she was the only person in a room full of people who made careers out of being noticed, who had not glanced at him once. He introduced himself. She shook his hand. Said it was nice to meet him in the tone you use with someone handing you a coffee. Returned to her clipboard. He had to work to get her to agree to dinner. He had to ask 3 times across 2 separate conversations before she said yes. And even then she said it with a slight pause that suggested she was fitting him into a schedule rather than clearing the schedule for him. He found this interesting. He should have read it as information. He mistook it for a challenge. And the difference between those 2 interpretations was the distance between the marriage they had and the marriage they could have had. Their first year together was genuinely good. He was attentive in the early months in the way that some men are attentive early, with the focused energy of someone pursuing something they want. He asked her questions about her work and listened to the answers. He came to her law school friend's birthday dinner and charmed everyone there without trying to dominate the room. He brought her coffee in the morning, made exactly the way she liked it, which he had figured out by paying attention rather than by asking. And there was something in that quiet observation that made her feel seen. She fell in love with him. She did. Let that be clear. This is not a story about a woman who married someone she did not love. It is a story about what love looks like when only one person in the room is doing the work of maintaining it. By the end of year 1, she had deferred the public interest firm. Just for now, she told herself. Just until we settle in. The papers went into a desk drawer. She would not open that drawer for 2 years. By the middle of year 2, She had missed the registration deadline for a housing law specialization exam she had been preparing for across 4 months. The gala on Thursday had required a gown that cost more than her first semester of law school, and the preparation had consumed the weekend she had set aside for studying. And by the time Monday came around, the deadline had passed and she was standing in a receiving line at the Whitmore Foundation dinner, smiling at people whose names she had to look up on her phone before conversations. By year 3, she had been introduced 4 times in one evening as Ethan's wife without anyone asking her name separately, and she had not corrected anyone, not once. That was the thing nobody warned you about. The disappearance did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened in inches. One skipped ambition, one canceled plan, one dinner party where someone shook your hand and looked past you to the man beside you, and you smiled and let them. And one day you looked in the mirror, and the woman looking back was polished and dressed beautifully and utterly unrecognizable. On an ordinary Tuesday in October, Claire Harper sat across the dinner table from her husband. He was reading something on his phone. She had been trying to start a conversation for 22 minutes. She had tried the news. She had tried a book she was reading. She had asked about his week. He answered in 3 words or less each time without looking up. Somewhere around the 22nd minute, she stopped trying. She looked at her food, and she realized that she could not remember the last time Ethan had asked her a single question that was not about scheduling. Not what she was thinking about, not what she was reading, not how she was feeling about the pregnancy that was now showing clearly enough that strangers on the street asked her about it. Not one question. In months, she sat very still. She did not cry. She was too tired for crying and too clear-eyed. She put both hands on the round curve of her stomach. 5 months along, the baby shifted under her palms, a slow rolling pressure that she had stopped finding strange weeks ago. She had started talking to him at night when the apartment got too quiet. She would tell him about Ohio, about front porches, about people who knew your name. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, she lay in the dark and made herself a promise. She was going to get out. She did not know how yet. She did not have the means. But she was going to get out, and she was going to do it right. She was a lawyer. Doing things right was the only way she knew. 6 months into the marriage's slow collapse, a name began appearing at the edges of Ethan's world. Vanessa Cole, architect. Her firm had won the contract to redesign the lobby of Ethan's flagship building on Park Avenue. He mentioned her once at breakfast, casually. The way you mention something when you have been thinking about it more than you want to show. Brilliant woman, he said, not looking up from his coffee. Real eye for space, the kind of instinct you either have or you don't. He said it the way you say something when the words are a smaller version of a larger thought. Claire noticed. She filed it. She said nothing, because she was 5 months pregnant and she did not yet have the floor to stand on. She was still building it. What happened between that breakfast and the Wednesday afternoon 4 months later is a story told in inches and silences. Ethan began coming home later. His phone began spending more time face down on surfaces. A particular care entered his grooming on evenings when he said he had a client dinner. He began suggesting that Claire skip events she would previously have been expected to attend, framing it as consideration for her pregnancy. And she accepted these suggestions with a quiet gratitude that was partly real and partly the careful gratitude of someone cataloging information. She noticed these things because she had been trained to notice the things people did not say. She noticed them and she did not say a word. Instead, she did something that would take Ethan's private investigator 5 weeks to partially unravel, and that would impress even the investigator when he finally understood the scope of it. She started building her floor. The first piece was a bank account. She opened it on a Wednesday morning at a branch on the east side of Manhattan that Ethan had never visited and had no reason to visit. She opened it under her maiden name, Claire Mills. Savings and checking. She deposited $300 in cash she had set aside from the household grocery allowance over 2 weeks. $300. That was the beginning. The second piece was work. She created a profile on a legal contracting platform called LexBridge under the name Claire Mills. She reviewed contracts remotely, 12 to 15 hours a week. Done early in the mornings before Ethan was awake or during the afternoons when he believed she was at prenatal yoga. Her ratings were exceptional immediately. Clients requested her specifically. She built a small but real reputation under a name that was technically hers, and that no one in her current life would think to search. She did all of this on a prepaid phone she had purchased with cash at a drugstore on the east side. She logged into LexBridge from a coffee shop, 3 blocks from the penthouse that Ethan had never entered. She left no digital trail in the apartment. Almost no trail. On one Tuesday afternoon in her 3rd week, she made a single mistake. She was exhausted from a morning appointment, and she logged into Lexbridge from the penthouse Wi-Fi rather than waiting until she could get to the coffee shop. Just once. 37 minutes of work before she caught herself and switched to the prepaid phone. 37 minutes. It was enough. Ethan's building management systems ran on a private network monitored by an IT team whose job was to flag unusual outgoing connections. The connection to Lexbridge was flagged and forwarded to Andrew Webb, Ethan's attorney of 11 years. Webb called Ethan on a Thursday evening. "Do you have any business with a legal contracting platform called Lexbridge?" Ethan said no. Then, why? Claire did not know any of this. She was at an actual prenatal appointment that afternoon, lying on a table listening to her son's heartbeat, which was strong and steady and 142 beats per minute. But a clock had started, and she had no idea it was running. The months that followed had a particular quality that Claire would later describe as living in two movies simultaneously. In the first movie, she was the attentive wife. She attended the events that required her attendance. She maintained the routines that their shared life depended on. She was pleasant at dinners and appropriately warm at gatherings, and she smiled at the right moments and said the right things. In the second movie, she was doing something else entirely. By month 4 of the pregnancy, her secret account held $8,000. By month 6, $19,000. She had contacted Patricia Hale, a law school friend in Pittsburgh, who had rebuilt her own life after a brutal divorce 7 years earlier, and who understood, without needing it explained, the particular architecture of what Claire was building. Patricia did not ask questions beyond what Claire volunteered. She started making calls. Claire researched small coastal towns with the same methodical attention she had once given to case law. She cross-referenced hospital locations, cost of living, distance from bus routes, population size. She was not romantic about it. She was precise. Coastal Cove, Oregon, population 4,200. Nearest full maternity ward 40 minutes south. Cost of living manageable. Distance from Manhattan. Exactly far enough. She painted the nursery yellow while Ethan was in Dubai for a conference. She did it herself, with a roller she bought at the hardware store on 68th Street and 3 coats applied over 2 days. She assembled the crib from a YouTube tutorial and a hex wrench on a Sunday afternoon. When she was done, she sat on the floor of the pale yellow room and she talked to her son the way she always talked to him when the apartment was quiet and she needed something real to hold on to. She told him about Columbus, about front porches, about the way her mother's kitchen smelled on Sunday mornings, about what it meant to live in a place where people knew your name. She told him that wherever they ended up, it was going to be real. And real, she had decided, was the only thing worth building toward. I need you to pay close attention to this next part, because this is the moment the title of this story is talking about. This is the moment she found out. And I want you to understand not just what she discovered, but what it cost her to stand there and hear it, and what she did in the 10 seconds after. Because those 10 seconds changed everything. A Wednesday afternoon in November, 30 weeks pregnant, Claire came home from a prenatal appointment at 2:45. She had been given good news at the appointment. The baby was positioned well. His growth was exactly where it should be. The midwife had smiled and said, "Strong boy," and Claire had held that phrase carefully on the subway ride home. She unlocked the door. The apartment was quiet in the way it usually was at this hour. She set her bag down in the entryway and slipped off her coat and hung it on the hook she always used. She could hear Ethan's voice from his study. The door was slightly open. She was not trying to listen. She was 10 feet from the study door, setting her keys on the entryway table. When the words reached her through the quiet afternoon air of the apartment, "She does not need to know anything yet. We have time to figure out the right way to handle this." Pause. And then a voice through the phone speaker. A woman's voice. Unhurried. Certain. "She is going to find out eventually. You know that." Ethan's voice. Quieter now. Almost careful. "Not yet. Just give me until after the baby. Please." Claire Harper stood in her hallway. 7.5 months pregnant. One hand still lifted toward the key hook, the other finding the wall beside her without her telling it to. She did not move. She did not make a sound. And in that moment, that one specific moment, in the quiet of the apartment she had lived in for 3 years, she understood 3 things simultaneously. First, it was real. Not a suspicion she had managed to keep at arm's length. Not a fear she could still choose not to examine. Real. Confirmed. In his own voice. Second, he had known. He had known she would find out eventually. He had been buying time. He had watched her carry his child across 7 months, had sat across from her at dinner and talked about scheduling, and attended the appointments he bothered to attend. And all of it had been a performance over a reality he was choosing not to share. Third, and this was the piece that hit hardest, the piece she would return to for months afterward. She was completely alone. In the most expensive apartment in a building she did not own. No independent income. No liquid savings outside the account she was still building. A baby 10 weeks away. And Ethan Caldwell had 4 attorneys on retainer whose combined hourly rate exceeded her entire monthly budget. She understood all 3 of those things in approximately 10 seconds. And then she did something that I think is one of the most remarkable things I have ever heard of a person doing under that kind of pressure. She closed her eyes. She breathed. She picked up her bag. She walked quietly to the bedroom, closed the door without a sound, and she opened her laptop. Not to cry, not to call her sister, not to walk back down that hallway and throw open the study door and say the truest and most devastating thing she had ever been equipped to say, to research. Because Claire Harper was a lawyer, and lawyers do not show their hand until their hand is strong enough to win. She found out on a Wednesday afternoon in November. She did not say a single word about it for 14 months. In those 14 months, she built something so thorough, so precise, so legally airtight that when she finally left, there was nothing he could do. Nothing. But first she had to survive the moment Andrew Webb called her in. It happened 3 weeks before her planned departure. She was 37 weeks pregnant. She had $34,000 in her account under Claire Mills. She had 3 active clients on Lexbridge. She had a bus ticket to Pittsburgh. She had Patricia waiting. She had Coastal Cove researched to the last detail. And then her phone rang. Andrew Webb, Ethan's attorney. He needed to discuss, he said, some household financial irregularities. He said it in the tone of a man who has learned to say difficult things without revealing how difficult they are. She met him in his Midtown office the following Tuesday. She sat across a desk from a man who had been Ethan's attorney for 11 years and who was. She understood clearly. Not her attorney and never had been. He asked about Lexbridge. She explained it without flinching. She said she had wanted independent spending money, that she had felt uncomfortable asking Ethan for personal purchases, especially as the pregnancy progressed and her needs were her own. She said it quietly, with the slight downward cast of someone confessing a small embarrassment. She let her eyes fill, just enough, not too much. Webb believed her, or he decided to. She left his office at 3:30. She walked to the coffee shop on Lexington Avenue, where she had spent so many mornings building her case, and she ordered a tea, and she sat at a table in the back, and she thought, they were looking. They might not know what they were looking for yet, but they were looking. That evening, alone in the apartment while Ethan was at a dinner she had not been invited to, she moved her departure date up by 2 weeks. She did not sleep much that night, but she did not panic. She thought, the window is closing. Then she thought, I am getting out first. Then she started packing. Here is what I want you to understand. And this is important because I hear this question every time this kind of story is told. Why did she not just confront him? Walk into that study. Say, I heard you. I know. And the honest answer is she almost did. She planned it 3 separate times. She rehearsed it in the shower. She wrote it out on a legal pad the way she used to write closing arguments. But here is what stopped her. She ran the scenario like a case, because that was her training, and it had not left her just because her life had been rearranged around someone else's ambitions. If she confronted Ethan that day, Andrew Webb would have a prenuptial review on Ethan's desk by morning. Her access to their joint accounts would be under scrutiny. She had no income he did not know about yet, not reliably. She was 30 weeks pregnant, in a divorce proceeding initiated at this stage. With Ethan's resources and her current position, she had limited leverage and considerable vulnerability. Confronting him that day would have been the most satisfying thing she had ever done, and the most devastating. So she did not. Instead, she sat across from him at dinner that Friday. That same dinner table, that same phone in his hand, and she smiled when he said something, and she passed the bread, and she asked about his week, and the entire time, she was building her case. There is something I want to say directly here. To anyone watching who has ever been in a situation where you knew something you were not supposed to know, and you did not know what to do with the knowing. Financial independence inside a marriage is not a lack of trust. It is basic protection. Know what accounts exist in your name. Know what is joint. Know what your rights are. Know what you would have if everything you assumed was solid suddenly was not. Claire had to rebuild her financial footing in secret while 7 months pregnant because she had nothing in her own name. She had traded her independence for a life that was built around someone else's needs and then discovered that the life could be revoked without notice. That is not a love story. That is a warning. What Claire Harper built over the next several months should be studied. Not because every woman needs to escape a marriage, but because every woman needs to understand how to build her own floor, so that no matter what collapses above her, she has something solid to stand on. By month 9 of her preparation, the account under Claire Mills held $34,000. It had grown from those first $300 through a discipline that was almost military in its consistency. 200 here, 350 there. Nothing that patterned in a way that would draw attention. She had read 3 different guides on financial forensics, specifically to understand what patterns would and would not flag. She applied what she read. She was meticulous. The Lexbridge income had grown steadily. By the 8th month, she had 7 regular clients who requested her specifically. She was billing approximately 16 hours a week, which meant she had an income, modest but real, that existed completely outside of anything connected to Ethan Caldwell or the life she was preparing to leave. Patricia Hale in Pittsburgh had done her part without being asked to do more than her part. She had found a sublet in her neighborhood available month to month. She had confirmed that Claire could stay with her for 2 weeks while she sorted her next step. She asked no questions beyond what Claire offered, which was not much, and accepted the situation with the quiet practicality of a woman who had done her own version of this rebuilding 7 years earlier and understood that what was needed was not discussion but logistics. The Greyhound ticket was booked under Claire Mills, departing Port Authority at 6:15 in the morning, westbound through the overnight routes. Arriving Pittsburgh 18 hours later, new prepaid phone, purchased with cash, new email on that phone, knew everything that was hers and only hers. She had assembled what she needed in Coastal Cove, Oregon. She had found the apartment listing through an online search, 2 bedrooms above a hardware store on the main street, owned by a couple named Carol and Frank Merritt, available month to month. She had emailed them from the new account. Frank had replied the same day, the nursery. Here is the thing about the nursery that I keep coming back to. While she was building her escape, while she was doing all of this with the precise and methodical energy of someone who has turned survival into a craft, she also painted a room yellow. She did it while Ethan was in Dubai for a conference. She bought the paint and the roller and the tray at the hardware store on 68th Street, took the subway back with everything in 2 bags that rested on her lap around the curve of her pregnancy, and she started on the walls that afternoon. It took her 2 full days. Her back ached. She was 32 weeks pregnant. She sat on the floor and did the trim with a brush and took breaks to talk to her son and then went back to the work. She assembled the crib from a YouTube tutorial that she watched 4 times, pausing and rewinding, using a hex wrench and a patience that surprised even her. When the last piece clicked into place on that Sunday afternoon, she sat on the floor and ran her hand along the wooden railing and found a slight roughness on one side where the sandpaper had caught. She left it there. She sat in the yellow room for a long time that afternoon, and she talked to her son. She told him about Columbus, about the way her mother's house smelled in October, about the neighbors who showed up when you needed them, about what it meant to live somewhere that was genuinely yours. She told him they were going to have that. Maybe not the same shape, definitely not the same price tag, but real. Real was the only thing worth building toward. She had planned to leave in mid-November. The meeting with Andrew Webb moved that date up by 2 weeks to the last week of October. She spent those final 2 weeks with the contained focus of a surgeon in the last hour of a long procedure. Every item was considered and either packed or left. Every digital connection was severed or transferred. She backed up the documents she needed to an encrypted drive she kept in her bag. She drafted her responses to the Lexbridge clients who had active contracts, explaining that she would be offline briefly and would resume work from a new location. She wrote a note. She wrote it and rewrote it over 3 nights. She filled an entire legal pad with versions that explained and accused and apologized and demanded. She crossed them all out. She got it down to 2 sentences. I am gone. Please do not look for me. She considered writing more. She thought about 3 years of dinners eaten while he looked at his phone. She thought about the nursery she had painted alone. She thought about the questions she had heard through the study door. Just give me until after the baby. 2 sentences was exactly right. She had already said everything else, in 100 different ways. Across 3 years, he had not been listening. More words would not change that. The night before she left, she checked her account one final time. $34,011. She sat with that number for a moment. It was not a fortune. It was a floor. She went to sleep at 9. She had set an alarm for 4:30. She did not need it. She was awake before it went off. 8 months into Claire's preparation, something happened that she had not fully accounted for. It did not come from Ethan. It came from Vanessa. On a Tuesday afternoon in September, Claire came home from a prenatal appointment to an apartment that smelled different. Not wrong, exactly, just different. A scent that was not hers and was not Ethan's. Something floral and expensive and entirely foreign to the space she had shared with him for 3 years. She set down her bag, walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, turned around, on the kitchen counter, Beside the coffee maker was a mug, white ceramic. It was not the mug Ethan used. It was not her mug. She did not own a white ceramic mug. There was a small red mark on the rim, lipstick, a shade she did not wear. She set her water glass down very carefully. She opened the cabinet beneath the sink where the trash can lived, and there, folded and tucked beneath other refuse with a tidiness that suggested deliberate concealment, was a receipt from the building's concierge service. Grocery delivery, placed at 7:02 in the morning. Signed V. Cole. Vanessa Cole had been in this apartment. Not at a hotel on the other side of the city. Not at a restaurant where proximity could be explained away. In this apartment. In Claire's home. Using Claire's kitchen. Sleeping in Claire's bed. While Claire was at the doctor. Listening to her son's heartbeat. Being told he was strong. Claire stood at the kitchen counter for 6 minutes. She knew it was 6 minutes because she had looked at the clock when she walked in, and she looked at it again when she moved. 6 minutes of absolute stillness. Then she walked to the nursery, sat down on the floor next to the crib she had built herself, put both hands on her stomach, and she stayed there until the feeling that was pressing against her chest from the inside became something she could contain. She was not going to cry about this in this apartment. She had made that decision in the kitchen, somewhere in those 6 minutes. She was not going to cry in a room she had painted with her own hands for a child who deserved better than the world he had been conceived into. She was going to finish the plan. She was going to do it right. And she was never going to let her son grow up watching a version of his mother who was invisible in her own life and called it marriage. She had been planning her exit. Now she was not planning it for herself alone. She was planning it for him. And that made it different. That made it unbreakable. The following 3 weeks had a crystalline quality. She was more certain than she had ever been. More focused. More disciplined. She was also, for the first time, angry. Not the diffuse sadness of the past 2 years. Not the tired resignation of a woman who has swallowed too many unspoken truths. This was clean anger. The kind that clarifies rather than clouds. The kind that a lawyer can use. She used it. She accelerated the timeline where she could. She moved more money. She finalized the arrangements with Patricia. She confirmed the apartment with Frank Merritt via her private email. She verified the Greyhound schedule twice. She sat across from Ethan at dinner and smiled and passed the bread and asked about his week. She was 34 weeks pregnant at the meeting with Andrew Webb. She sat across from him in his Midtown office and delivered the performance of her legal career. She cried just enough, not too much. She explained the account with the composed vulnerability of a woman embarrassed by a small secret rather than a woman who had been building her exit for 8 months. Webb believed her. She left his office and moved her departure date up by 2 weeks. On the morning she left, she rose at 4:30. She dressed in the dark, slowly and without hurry. The apartment was quiet around her in the particular way of spaces that do not yet know they are about to be vacated. She passed the nursery door. She did not go in. She had built what she could in that room. She was taking the most important thing from it with her. She passed the kitchen counter. She set the notepad with the 2 sentences in the center of the counter where the grocery lists usually lived. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her bag. One bag, maternity clothes. Her laptop. Documents that were only hers. A small wooden jewelry box her mother had given her, containing 2 pearl earrings and a photograph of herself at 22 laughing at something off camera. A version of herself she was going back to find. She rode the elevator alone. 42 floors. The lobby doorman, Tom, looked up from his desk. He had said good morning to her for 3 years. Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell. Good morning, Tom. She smiled at him, because she was still kind, even now, especially now. She walked out into the November dark. Into a cab, to Port Authority, to the Greyhound that departed at 6:15 westbound. She did not look back at the building. Not because she was angry, not because she had hardened herself against it, because she had learned something important in 14 months of preparation. You cannot drive forward while looking in the rearview mirror. She was done looking back. Ethan Caldwell found the note at 11:30 that morning. He had come back to the penthouse between meetings. His 11 o'clock had run short and he had wanted to change his shirt before a lunch across town. He almost missed the notepad. It was sitting where Claire usually left grocery lists. He read it once, read it again, called her cell phone. The call did not connect. The number had been discontinued. Called again. Same result. Sent a text. No delivery confirmation. The phone was already gone. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. His first thought, embarrassingly even to him, was logistical. There was a foundation dinner in 3 weeks she was supposed to attend. He had already confirmed 2 seats. His second thought was that she would come back. She was 7 months pregnant. Where was she going to go? He did not yet understand that she had already answered that question. He did not yet understand that the 14 months he had spent not paying attention to his wife had been 14 months she had spent answering exactly that question in meticulous and irrefutable detail. By that evening, Vanessa Cole was in the penthouse. By the following morning, she had started talking. Not publicly, not yet, but within the social and professional circles that surrounded Ethan's life. The story began moving through the rooms that mattered. Claire Harper had walked out on her husband while 7 months pregnant. She had been emotionally unstable for some time. There were concerns about her judgment. Her behavior in recent months had been erratic. She had been struggling. Everyone had noticed. The word erratic was used with particular care and frequency. Claire's name, her real name, Claire Harper, was being whispered through rooms she would never walk into again. Former colleagues, professional contacts, people who had respected the work she had done before the marriage rearranged her life. People who had known her as someone capable and serious and worth knowing. And she did not know. She was on a bus to Pittsburgh, watching the highway lights blur past in the November dark. 37 weeks pregnant, sitting with her one bag in the seat beside her and her hand on her stomach, and the particular feeling of someone who has just done the most difficult and most necessary thing of her life. She fell asleep somewhere in Pennsylvania. When she arrived at Patricia's in Pittsburgh, the two women sat in the kitchen and drank tea and said less than you might expect. Patricia asked a few practical questions. Claire answered them. They made a plan for the 2 weeks before Claire needed to keep moving. That was all that was needed. On the second day, Patricia received a call from a mutual contact in the New York legal community. The contact asked, carefully, whether Patricia knew anything about Claire Harper's current situation, and then mentioned, also carefully, that an inquiry had been filed with the New York State Bar Association regarding a contracting professional operating under the name Claire Mills, suggesting possible misappropriation of client funds. Patricia came into the kitchen where Claire was eating her first real meal in 2 days. She sat down across the table. She told her what she had heard. Claire set down her fork. She looked at the notification on her laptop screen. The Bar Association inquiry was there, formal and official and built on nothing, built on air, but it was there. She was 37 weeks pregnant. She had $34,000 and a bus ticket. She had 3 clients who trusted her and a name she had rebuilt from the materials of her own life. And someone had just filed a formal accusation against that name. Someone who knew her maiden name. Someone who knew her contracting platform. Someone who had access to the details of her secret professional life through their proximity to Ethan. There was only one person who fit that description. Claire sat at Patricia's kitchen table for a long time. The meal went cold. Patricia waited, which was what Patricia was good at, waiting without commentary. And then Claire opened her laptop. She opened a new document, and she started writing her response, point by point, evidence by evidence. Every contract she had ever completed through Lexbridge was documented. Every communication, every timestamp, every delivery confirmation, every client review. She had kept everything, kept it with the systematic completeness of a lawyer who understood that records are the difference between having a case and having nothing. She had been keeping records for 14 months. She had kept them for exactly this. By midnight, her response was ready. 3,000 words of documented, time-stamped, irrefutable professional history. She filed it the following morning, and then she finished packing her bag. Because she had not come this far to stop here. She had not painted that nursery yellow and assembled that crib and moved $200 a week and sat across dinner tables from a man who looked at his phone while she disappeared. She had not done all of that to be stopped by a woman who had made the same mistake Ethan had made. Both of them had underestimated what Claire Harper was capable of when she had enough. She had enough. She had more than enough. She got on the next bus west, Coastal Cove, Oregon, population 4,200, 40 minutes from the nearest full-service maternity ward. 6 inches of rain in November alone. The Pacific coast at its most gray and serious and undecorated. Claire arrived on a Thursday afternoon with one bag and a pregnancy that was now 10 days from its due date and a body that had not slept properly in weeks. She had been traveling for 2 days with a stop in Pittsburgh and a change in Portland. Frank Merritt met her at the apartment. He was in his mid-60s with the unhurried directness of someone who had stopped trying to impress people before Claire was born. He walked her through the 2 rooms above the hardware store and told her the important things without being asked. The heater needed to be set 4 degrees higher than your target temperature. Something in the thermostat had never been fixed. The window in the second bedroom stuck in humid weather. The third stair had a loose board he had been meaning to replace since 2019. He looked at her stomach without self-consciousness. Baby coming. About 10 days, she said. He nodded. Carol will want to bring things. She will ask first. You can say no. He said it without pressure. Just as information. She took the apartment. On her second morning, she walked to the beach before the town was awake. The sky was gray and the ocean was enormous and cold and entirely indifferent to her existence. She stood at the edge of the dry sand and looked at it for a long time. She felt something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to name it. She felt like the right size. Not small, not overlooked, not a detail in someone else's larger story, just proportionate to her surroundings. In Manhattan, she had existed inside a life so enormous that she had become a footnote in it. Here the ocean was vast and the sky was wide, and neither of them cared who she was or what she was worth. And paradoxically, that impersonal vastness gave her room to take up actual space. She found the bookstore on her fourth day. Tide and Page occupied a narrow storefront between a bakery and an insurance office on the main block of Coastal Cove. There was a handwritten index card in the window. Part-time help wanted. Books a plus. Patience required. She walked in. The owner was a woman named Betty Rhodes, 61 years old, who had opened this store 20 years ago with her severance pay from a publishing company in Portland, and who had the manner of someone who stopped performing anything for anyone a long time ago and had not missed it since. Betty looked at her over reading glasses. You are about to have a baby. 8 weeks, roughly, Claire said. I can work until I cannot, and then I would like to come back. How long after? 6 weeks, maybe 8. Betty studied her. Last woman I hired told me she could handle anything. Cried in the poetry section twice in 1 week. I do my crying somewhere private, Claire said. Where? Bus bathroom, Ohio, a few weeks ago. I think I am done now. Betty took off her reading glasses and looked at her for a long moment. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9 to 2. Do not reorganize anything without asking me first. Claire started Monday. She reorganized the entire inventory database by Wednesday. Betty pretended to be annoyed. She was not annoyed. Noah James Harper arrived on a Thursday morning in late January. 6 pounds 11 ounces. 11 hours of labor that was neither smooth nor unbearable, just difficult in the specific way of something real and consequential. Claire got through it the way she had been getting through things for months, by staying in the present moment and not looking too far ahead. She had called her sister Dana from the hospital parking lot the night before when contractions came in a pattern she recognized from the book she had read 3 times. Dana offered immediately to get on a plane. I will be okay, Claire said. That is not what I asked. There was a pause. A couple across the waiting room. Young, the woman clearly in early labor. The man holding her hand and looking like a person who had run out of useful things to do. Claire watched them for a moment. No, she said. I do not want you to come. But I will call you after. You will call me the minute after. The minute after. She called 19 hours later. Her voice was rough. Her arm ached from the IV they had removed an hour earlier. And she was holding a 6 pound 11 ounce boy who had his father's jawline in her eyes and a way of looking around the delivery room with focused, frowning attention that made her laugh. Her first real laugh in 4 months. Noah, she told Dana. There was a pause on the line. Dana's voice, when it came, was not entirely steady. Hi, Noah. Claire looked down at him. He had stopped frowning. He was looking at her now. That myopic searching look that everyone says is reflexive and means nothing, and that she decided she did not care was reflexive. Hi, she said quietly. That was the whole world, right there. The first 3 months were the kind of hard that you can prepare for intellectually, and that turns out to be different in practice from anything intellectual. She was tired in ways that accumulated faster than sleep could address. Noah had a period in weeks 6 and 7 of crying from approximately 9 in the evening until 1 in the morning for reasons that no amount of feeding or changing or rocking or reasoning could identify. Claire spent those evenings walking the apartment in the dark, bouncing him, negotiating with him in the reasonable tone she had once used with opposing counsel, explaining that she understood his position, but that they needed to find a compromise they could both live with. He was unimpressed by this strategy. Carol Merritt appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in week 4 with a casserole and the unsolicited but entirely accurate observation that the baby had colic and that the best thing for it was motion and time and the acceptance that some nights were just going to be what they were. My third was the same, Carol said, sitting at the kitchen table with the ease of someone who had made herself useful rather than merely present. 4 months of it. I cried more than he did. I have been close, Claire admitted. That is normal. That is fine. Carol pushed the casserole toward her. Eat something. You look like you have been surviving on coffee and intention. She had been. She ate the casserole. Carol came back Thursday with another dish and a baby carrier she had ordered from the internet after researching best carrier for colic. The carrier helped, not with the crying, which continued on its own schedule, but with the carrying. Noah quieted faster when he was against her chest, his ear over her heartbeat, and she could move around the apartment with her hands free and still feel like a functional person rather than an extension of someone else's need, which was an irony she was entirely aware of. Spring came to Coastal Cove gradually and then all at once. Weeks of gray, and then one morning the light changed and the air smelled different, and the town reorganized itself around warmth with the ease of a place that has seen this pattern many times. Claire went back to Tide and Page when Noah was 7 weeks old, bringing him in as carrier 3 mornings a week. She shelved books and talked to customers and helped Betty update the store's inventory database, which had been maintained with the cheerful inaccuracy of someone who found digital systems vaguely insulting. "I had a system," Betty said, watching Claire reorganize with an expression of mild defensive interest. "Your system listed 47 titles as available that you have not stocked in 3 years. People could order them. You could also tell them that directly instead of having them drive here and be disappointed." Betty looked at her over her reading glasses. "Can I fix it?" "I suppose you are going to anyway." She fixed it. The customers who came to Tide and Page were the kind of people who still came to bookstores despite having phones in their pockets, which meant they wanted something the phone did not give them. Mostly they wanted to talk. Claire was good at talking about books in the way that only people who read to live rather than to appear are good at it, without performance, without the affected enthusiasm of someone selling something. She gave genuine recommendations, and she did not oversell things, and when she did not know something she said so directly, which Betty told her was rarer than it had any right to be. "Most people bluff," Betty said. "I was a lawyer. Bluffing in court has actual consequences. So does bluffing at a bookstore, in my opinion, but I seem to be in the minority." By Noah's 3rd month, Claire had found something she had not expected, a life that fit, not a perfect life. The apartment was drafty and the heater could never quite compensate. The job paid modestly and her savings, though careful, were not unlimited. She had days when the loneliness of it, the specific loneliness of someone who had voluntarily exited her entire previous world, pressed in with a weight she had to work against consciously. But those days did not define the days. The days were defined by smaller and more immediate things. Noah's expressions, which shifted week by week with a rapid aliveness that she found genuinely astonishing. The morning walks along the beach road, the way the town felt on weekday afternoons, quiet and real and scaled to actual human life in a way that Manhattan had never quite been for her. And then, on a Tuesday morning in April when Noah was 3 months old, a man walked into Tide and Page who was clearly not from Coastal Cove. His suit was too precise for the coastal weather. His shoes were wrong. He browsed the shelves for 22 minutes without once reading the spine of a book he looked at. Then he asked Betty, very casually, for recommendations on local accommodations. Betty told him about the Cove Inn, 2 blocks down. He left. Claire had moved to the back shelves the moment he walked in. She stood with Noah sleeping against her chest and counted her own heartbeats until she heard the door close. She never found out who he was. She never found out who had sent him, but she moved Noah to Carol's every morning for 2 weeks. She changed her walking route. She stopped going to the beach at the same time every day, because she had built something here that was worth protecting, and she was not going to let it be taken by someone paid to find her by the man who had spent 3 years not bothering to look at her at all. Now I need to tell you what Ethan Caldwell lost. Not in vague emotional terms, not in metaphors about silence and absence. I mean concretely, specifically, in the order it happened, because the title of this story makes a promise. He lost everything, and I want you to understand exactly what everything means. Loss number 1, his wife and his son. His child was born in a hospital 40 minutes south of a small Oregon town that Ethan could not find on a map. He had never seen his son. He did not know that Noah had his jawline in his mother's eyes. He did not know that the boy had strong opinions about which shoe went on first, defending this position with the absolute conviction of someone who had never once been wrong about anything. He did not know about the way Noah looked around every room he entered like he was taking inventory. He knew a son existed. That was all he knew. Loss number 2, his professional authority. The board meeting was on a Tuesday in November, 6 weeks after Claire left. Ethan walked in carrying a folder he had not fully read. He told himself it was fine. He had been doing this for 15 years. His knowledge of the company was structural, built into him. He started the presentation the way he always started. Overview, market positioning, quarter highlights. He moved through the first 10 minutes without difficulty. Then Arthur Crane, 71 years old and on the board since Ethan's father's time, asked a question about the Riverside development timeline. Ethan opened his mouth. The answer was not there, not delayed, not misremembered, gone. A clean absence where specific knowledge was supposed to be. He found the page. Read the number. Continued. 12 minutes later, Linda Park asked about the insurance provisions on the Harbor Point acquisition. Ethan reached for the answer. His mind produced instead, with absolute photographic precision, the image of a pale yellow room, a wooden crib, a rough patch on the railing on one side where the sandpaper had caught. He stopped talking, mid-sentence. The room was very quiet. James Whitfield, to his left. Ethan. Ethan put both hands flat on the table, looked at them. "I need a minute," he said. He stood up and walked out of the boardroom. Went to the men's room at the end of the hall, ran cold water over his hands and looked at himself in the mirror. He looked exactly like himself. Same face, same suit, same neutral expression he had maintained in professional settings since adolescence. But something behind the expression had given way, something load-bearing. He went back, sat down, and said 6 words that Ethan Caldwell had not said in 15 years of running that company. "I am not prepared today." He rescheduled to Thursday. The 12 board members gathered their materials with the careful discretion of people who had collectively decided to handle something difficult with grace. Arthur Crane caught his eye across the table and gave him one small nod that was not quite sympathy and not quite approval, and was more useful than either. Loss number 2. The first time he walked out of his own boardroom. Loss number 3. Operational control of his company. The week after the board meeting, he called his chief operating officer and brought in Harmon as interim operational lead. What this meant was that Ethan Caldwell, for the first time in the history of the company his father had started and that he had spent 20 years building into something his father could not have imagined, was no longer making the daily decisions. He planned to extend Harmon's role for 1 quarter. It extended through 2, because the company ran better. Everyone could see it, including Ethan. Loss number 3. The discovery that what he had built did not need him the way he had always believed it did. That was harder to absorb than any of the others. Loss number 4. The penthouse. In March he sold it. He had Rebecca list it through a private broker without announcement. Within 3 weeks there was an offer at asking price from a tech executive relocating from San Francisco. He signed the papers in Andrew Webb's office and went back to the apartment and spent 1 hour moving through the rooms, deliberately, acknowledging each space before he stopped living in it. He stopped at the nursery last. The crib was still there, the pale yellow walls, the folded blanket at the foot of the crib, still folded the way Claire had folded it, waiting for an occupant who had been born somewhere Ethan had no access to. He reached out and ran his hand along the wooden railing, found the rough patch on one side where the sandpaper had caught. She had done this herself, built this herself, while he was in Dubai, while he was not paying attention to the person building things 40 feet away from him in his own home. He stood there for a long time. Loss number 4. A home he had been proud of giving her. Gone. Because it turned out a home is not something you give someone. It is something you build together. And he had never once picked up a tool. Loss number 5. The contract and the truth about Vanessa. Vanessa had sent a letter, well written, carefully argued. It made the case that Claire's 14 months of secret preparation was its own form of deception. That a woman who builds her exit while accepting the benefits of a marriage is engaged in something as dishonest as anything Ethan had done. Ethan read that paragraph twice. He thought about Claire living in the penthouse across 14 months. He thought about what she had been staying in and why she had been staying in it. He thought about a woman with no independent financial options who needed to build those options quietly before a door could close on her. He folded the letter. He wrote a reply through his own attorney. Short, clear, final. The business relationship between Caldwell Properties and Cole Architecture was being dissolved at the end of the current contract period. No negotiation, no extension. This cost him the Park Avenue lobby project, $4.2 million in contracted work. He signed the dissolution without discussion, and then Gordon Reeves, his private investigator, brought him something he had not expected. The Bar Association inquiry against Claire, filed under her contracting name, had been traced. Gordon had followed it carefully and quietly, and it led where Ethan had, in the back of his mind, suspected it might lead, to someone with access to details that were not public, someone close enough to his world to have learned things that should not have been findable. Ethan sat with that information for 2 days, and then he called the New York State Bar Association himself. He provided documentation. He confirmed under his own name that Claire Mills was a contractor of impeccable professional integrity. He confirmed that the inquiry had originated from a source with a direct personal conflict of interest. He named the source. Nobody had asked him to do this. Nobody would have known if he did not. He did it anyway. The inquiry was dismissed within 48 hours. Dana called Claire on a Tuesday evening, told her what had happened, told her Ethan had made the call himself, unprompted, without telling anyone he was going to. Loss number 5. The contract, the $4.2 million, and the last version of himself that could maintain a comfortable story about his own conduct. Loss number 6. The social world. By April, Ethan had stopped attending events, the foundation dinners, the industry galas, the charity boards, the whole choreographed machinery of being Ethan Caldwell in Manhattan. He just stopped. His absence was noted and remarked upon and attributed to various things by various people. He did not correct any of them. He moved into a smaller apartment in Brooklyn. Not dramatically small. He was not performing austerity, just a human-scaled space. A kitchen the right size for one person. Street noise. A view of other people's windows and the evidence of other people's actual lives. He started doing work for a community development nonprofit, not as a donor writing a check from a safe distance, which was how he had previously engaged with charitable work. He went in person. He sat in meetings. He used what he knew about real estate and contract structure to help organizations trying to build affordable housing in neighborhoods where the market had turned against it. The work was slow and frequently frustrating. He kept going back. His uncle Roy called on his birthday in May. "Heard you made some changes," Roy said. He was 70 years old, had spent his career teaching high school history in Queens and driving the same car for 12 years and attending every school play his kids were ever in. "From who, Marcus? He is proud of you." "Does not say it like that." But Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I am trying to do better." "Yeah," Roy said. His voice was warm in the way of people who do not use warmth as a strategy. "Your father never did figure that part out. The trying to do better. He just kept trying to do more." Pause. "Different things. Those two." "I know," Ethan said. "I understand that now." "Good. Come have dinner sometime. Sheila makes too much food on Sundays and we eat it for days." He went to Sunday dinner in June. It was loud and crowded and the food was too much and everyone talked at once and nobody asked about quarterly projections. He drove back to Brooklyn afterward and sat in his car for a few minutes before going inside. Something had shifted. He could feel it but could not name it. Something that felt like progress towards something he did not yet have language for. Loss number 7. The story he had been telling himself about the kind of man he was. That was the loss that cost the most and took the longest and was, in the end, the only one that left room for anything worth having. October. Noah was 13 months old. He had opinions about his shoes, specifically about which shoe went on first and how. And he held these opinions with the absolute unshakable certainty of someone who had never once in his life been wrong about anything. Claire had learned that negotiating with a 13-month-old was similar to negotiating with opposing counsel in that both parties were completely certain they were right and neither one was going to back down easily. She had gotten good at it. On the second Thursday of October, there was a regional land use conference at the Coastal Cove Inn. 200 attendees from around the Pacific Northwest, most of them professionals in real estate development, urban planning, architecture. They were in town for a long weekend. Betty had noted with mild commercial satisfaction that conference weekends always brought good traffic to the bookstore. The kind of people who came to these events tended to spend their unscheduled evening hours looking for bookstores. Claire opened Tide and Page at 9 that Thursday morning. Noah was at Carol's, their Thursday morning arrangement for the past several months, which gave Claire 3 hours of work without the additional management layer of a 1-year-old who wanted to organize the shelves by cover color. She was finishing a new staff picks display that Betty had asked her to put together, arranging the titles in the careful order she had worked out the afternoon before. The bell above the door sounded at 9:40. She did not look up. She was balancing a stack of titles in a specific configuration, and she needed another 3 seconds. "I will be right with you," she said. She finished the stack. She turned around. Ethan Caldwell was standing in the doorway of her bookstore. She registered this the way you register facts before feelings, as information before meaning. He had changed. The suit was different, not bespoke, not a signal of anything. Just a good jacket on a man who had stopped using his clothing as armor. He was thinner or not thinner exactly, but more settled into himself, less held together by performance. Gray at the temples that had not been there before. His eyes found hers and stayed. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Claire spoke first. "How did you find me?" Not a question, a statement made in the tone she had used in depositions. He answered immediately. "I did not. I swear to you. I am here for the Cascade Land Use Summit. I registered 6 weeks ago. I had no idea that you were." He stopped. "I am staying at the Cove Inn. My assistant booked it. I did not know." She watched him. The lawyer in her measuring, reading the micro-expressions the way she had been trained to read them. She did not find a tell. If you had known, she said carefully, would you have come anyway? A long pause. He considered the question honestly. No, he said. That would not have been my right. Something in her face shifted, barely perceptible. But there, come in then, she said. He entered the store and she stepped back to give him room, and for a moment they were simply two people in a bookstore on a Thursday morning, with 3 years of unspoken things between them and no script for how to proceed. He did not try to fill the silence. This was different. The Ethan she had known filled every silence with momentum, with the next point, the next agenda item, the forward motion that had been his default mode for as long as she had known him. This man stood in her bookstore and let the quiet sit between them until it settled. How long have you been here? 3 years. Just over. He nodded, looked at the shelves, the display, the careful arrangement of the space. You work here. I do. It suits you. He said it and then immediately. I do not mean that in any. I know what you mean, she said. You are right. It does. He looked at her with an expression she did not have a category for. Layered. Containing things he was not going to try to compress. I know about the bar association, she said. Dana told me. He nodded. Did not reach for credit. I know it is over, she said. With Vanessa. It ended when you left. He said it simply. I want you to know that is not why I'm saying this. It is not connected to any hope about, Ethan, she said. He stopped. I know. A brief silence. I need to apologize to you, he said. Not as a. He stopped. Started again. I have rehearsed versions of this. They all sound like performances. So I am going to say it plainly. He met her eyes. I was a bad husband to you. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind you can point at and say, that is the moment. The kind that happens gradually. That is harder to name because nobody does anything dramatic enough to create a clear before and after. I made you invisible inside a life I was proud of providing. And I never once asked if it was the life you wanted. Not once in 3 years. He said this without crying, without reaching for her, without the theatrical quality of a speech that has been thought about for too long. He said it the way you say a true thing you have been living with long enough that all the performance has worn off. Claire looked at him. She had imagined this moment, not obsessively and not often, but in the way you prepare quietly for something you understand is possible. She had imagined different versions of it. In some of them she had been composed and clear. In others she had asked him to leave immediately. In others she had felt the vindication she had expected to feel at being seen at last by the person who had failed to see her. What she felt was quieter than any of those versions. Something closer to the feeling of a door that had been stuck for a long time finally opening. Not with force, but with the gradual yielding of something that had simply become ready. I know, she said. I believe you. He nodded. There was someone else, he said carefully. During part of it, I think you knew. I knew. I am not with her. I have not been since before you left. I want you to know that is not. I know, she said. A pause. I forgave you, she said. Not immediately, not easily, but I did. Because I could not move forward carrying it, and I needed to move forward. That is not about you. That was for me. But it is done. He looked at her. Thank you, he said simply, without making it into something it was not. It does not change things, she said immediately. I need you to understand that. The marriage is over. This is not the beginning of something. That is not cruelty. That is just true. I understand, he said. He said it cleanly, without the slight pause that would have suggested he needed to convince himself. The bell above the door sounded. A woman came in looking for a travel guide to the Oregon coast. Claire helped her find it, rang her up. The woman left. The store was quiet again. Noah, he said. He said it like a word he had been carrying carefully for a long time. He is 13 months, Claire said. He is healthy. He has your jawline and my stubbornness and very strong opinions about footwear. Ethan laughed. One real, brief, unguarded laugh. The kind that gets out before you have time to manage it. He sounds like you, Ethan said. He also sounds like you, Claire said. Because it was true, and because honesty was the only currency she had left to offer and the only one she trusted. I know I do not have the right to ask anything, Ethan said. I want to be clear that I know that. I am not here to make a claim. I am not here to make this hard for you. I have tried very hard not to make this hard for you. He paused. I just needed you to know that I see it now. What I did. What I cost you. What it cost both of us. A long moment. I need to say one more thing, he said. And I need you to hear it as what it is and not as what it is not. She waited. I stopped the search 4 months after you left. Not because I found you. Because I realized what the search actually was. Gordon told me that a woman who plans the way you plan does not want to be found. And he asked me whether I was searching because I wanted you to be safe, or because I was not comfortable not knowing where you were. I sat with that question for a week, and then I called it off. She held his eyes for a moment. He confirmed this, she said. Dana told me. I thought she might. She looked at him for a long time, measuring, reading, deciding. I am not making any promises today, she said. I need you to understand that clearly. But at some point, when I decide how and when, Noah should know his father exists, and he should know his father tried. She paused. Did you try, Ethan? Actually try. Not the version of trying that is really just waiting to succeed. He held her gaze. I am trying, he said. I am still working at things I should do more naturally. But yes, actually trying. That is the right answer, she said. He wrote his number on a page from the notepad beside the register, pushed it across the counter without adding words. Let it sit there. The conference ends Sunday, he said at the door. I am at the Cove Inn. Okay, she said. He looked at her one last time. She knew what he was looking for. Not reconciliation. Not the marriage returned to him. Just some confirmation that something human had survived all of it. That whatever was left between them was not only damage. She gave him that. Not with words. By meeting his eyes and not looking away, he nodded. And he left. Betty came in at 11. She took one look at Claire and set her coat on the hook by the door with the deliberate calm of someone assessing a situation. You look like something happened. Something happened. Do you want to talk about it? Not yet. Okay. Betty picked up the order clipboard. 16 boxes of Clearwater shipment in the back. She went to the back without another word. And then, from the back room, Emma. Claire turned. Betty was standing in the doorway, clipboard in hand, reading glasses pushed up on her head. You all right? Claire thought about the question. Really thought about it. Yeah, she said. I think I am. Betty nodded once. Went back to the inventory. Claire stood in the quiet bookstore for a moment. The staff picks display was still half finished. The coffee maker in the back room had finished its cycle. Somewhere outside on the main street, a delivery truck was idling. Ordinary Thursday morning things. She looked at the piece of paper on the counter. Then she picked it up, folded it once, and put it in her jacket pocket. She finished the display. She picked Noah up from Carol's at noon. He came to the door at his full operational speed, which was somewhere between a fast walk and a controlled fall forward, and hit her at knee height with both arms, and announced in the rapid overlapping manner of someone with many things to report that he had eaten 2 crackers, that Carol's cat had regarded him with what he clearly considered an unjustified level of suspicion, and that he wanted to go to the beach. We can go to the beach, Claire said. After lunch. He considered these terms. He had learned over the past several months that negotiating on timing was more productive than negotiating on outcomes. After lunch. He confirmed. After lunch. On the beach that afternoon, the sky had cleared and the ocean was calmer than it had been in weeks, the waves coming in at an angle that pushed them far up the sand before retreating. Noah ran at the water and retreated from it, screaming with a delight that was completely genuine and completely renewed each time, as though every wave was the first wave he had ever encountered, as though the fact that the water came closer than expected was a discovery rather than a pattern. He had been doing this for a year. He was still surprised every single time. Claire stood at the edge of the dry sand and watched him and thought about what it meant to raise a person, not the logistics of it, which she was still learning and would be learning for years. She thought about the less visible work, the work of becoming someone your child could look at and learn from, the work of being honest about your own failures without making your child carry them, the work of making sure that the life he was watching you live was actually lived, not managed, not performed, not maintained out of habit because you had built it so elaborately that dismantling it seemed impossible. Actually lived. She thought about what she would tell Noah someday about his father. Not the whole story, not for a long time, but eventually some version of it, age-appropriate and honest and refusing both of the easy options. She was not going to make Ethan a villain for a child who deserved a more complicated truth than that. She was not going to erase him from the picture as though Noah had arrived without a history. The truth was what it was. A man who had failed at something important and who had, apparently, spent 3 years finding out what that failure actually cost him and what it required of him to address it. That was not nothing. He deserved to know where he came from. He deserved a father who had genuinely tried to become someone worth knowing. He also deserved a mother who made those decisions on his behalf with care and without bitterness, and who handed the decision to him when he was old enough to make it himself. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the piece of paper. She looked at it for a moment. Ethan's handwriting, which she recognized and which was smaller and neater than you would expect from someone who moved through the world with such large confidence. Just a number. Nothing else. She looked at Noah. He had turned around and was running back toward her, wet below the knees, breathing hard, eyes bright. He ran at her the way he ran at everything, fully and without reservation, certain she would be there. She was there. She took out her phone. She did not call. She was not ready for that yet. She did not know exactly what she wanted from that conversation, or how to frame it, or what she would need in place before she could have it clearly. She needed to think about it. She needed to decide on her terms and in her time, from the solid ground she had built, with the clarity of a woman who no longer made decisions from fear or anger or the desperate mathematics of someone with no options. She opened her contacts. She typed the number in. She paused at the name field. She thought about what to call it. What name would be right? What name would be true? She typed Noah's dad. Not Ethan. Not Caldwell. Not a wound dressed up as a contact. Not a warning she looked at every time she opened her phone. Noah's dad. Because that was what was true. That was what mattered. That was the only frame that put the right person at the center of the decision. She put the phone in her pocket. Noah arrived at her feet and grabbed both of her hands with his two small hands and pulled. Again, she looked at him. 13 months old. Serious and bright and entirely his own person already. Becoming more himself every single week in ways that startled and delighted her. Again, she agreed. She took his hand and they walked back toward the water together. The wave came in. He shrieked and ran and she walked after him. And the wave retreated and he stopped and turned back to look at her, making sure she was there. Making that quick check that toddlers make 100 times a day. Are you still there? Are you still there? Still here, she said, though he had not spoken. He grinned. The big unguarded grin that was entirely his own, that she had not taught him and could not have taught him. That was just who he was. He turned back to the ocean. Some people spend their whole lives moving away from something. They navigate by the shape of the absence. Let the loss be the loudest thing in the room. Measure every new thing against the old thing they are still mourning. I understand that. Loss is loud. It knows how to fill a room and keep you standing in the center of it long after the room has stopped being useful. But Claire Harper had learned something in Coastal Cove that she thought was the most useful thing she had ever learned. More useful than anything from law school. More hard-won than anything from the marriage. She had learned the difference between moving away from something and moving towards something. Even when the direction looked the same from the outside, one leaves you hollow, driven, maybe, purposeful, in the way that running from something gives you something to push against, but hollow. The other leaves you full, not perfect, not finished, not without the 3 in the morning moments when the weight of what brave decisions cost comes pressing in, and there is nothing to do but sit with it, not without the drafty window and the overcompensating heater and the inventory database that needed rebuilding and the Tuesdays when the loneliness of starting over pressed in harder than usual. But full. Claire was full. She had built a floor from nothing. From $300 and a prepaid phone and a Lex Bridge account, and the particular discipline of a woman who understood that the only way out was through, and that through required preparation. She had built it while 7 months pregnant. She had built it while living inside the life she was trying to leave. She had built it while painting a nursery yellow and assembling a crib on a Sunday afternoon and talking to her son about front porches and people who knew your name. She had built it, and then she had stood on it. And no one, not Ethan Caldwell, not Vanessa Cole, not a bar association inquiry, not 14 months of invisible war against a life that was designed to contain her, was ever going to take that floor away. Noah turned around again, found her eyes across the sand. Again she walked to him, took his hand in hers. Again, she said, and they walked back toward the water together, into the waves, into the ordinary, into the irreplaceable, into a life that was finally, completely, and without qualification hers.